My name is Jackson Brill. I'm a new coach here at Sharman Ultra, but I've been coaching runners in some form or fashion since 2015. So almost ten years now. I've coached everything from the 800 meters on a track to 200-mile trail races. So span a wide range of events. Outside of coaching, I studied physiology at the University of Colorado. Got my undergrad and master's there, and I worked in a exercise science research lab there, specifically studying uphill running and walking and how and why to transition between the two. So quite applicable research for the world of trail and ultra running that we're all in. I've studied a couple peer-reviewed research papers on that topic as well that were related to my undergraduate and graduate research. As an athlete, I like to focus more on steep and technical races, both sub-ultra and ultra distance. For example, I have won the Rut 50K up in Montana and have gotten second at the U.S. Trail Marathon Championships, which in 2023 qualified me for the World Trail and Mountain Running Championships, where I got to represent Team USA over in Austria. So here, over the next 45 minutes or so, I will be answering both live questions as well as other questions that were sent in advance. Just for so everyone knows, past sessions with other coaches that have done Facebook Lives are here on the Sharman Ultra coaching Facebook page, so feel free to go back and peruse those previous Q&As with other coaches, and those are also on the Sharman Ultra website if you want to access them that way. Awesome. Well, we will go ahead and start asking some questions. So here Ian put a question up that I believe is from Ellie, but I will read it. I know that Jackson has done scientific research on carbon-plated / superfoam shoes for road running. What are Jackson's thoughts on mid-packers using super shoes on road ultras? Let me see where the rest of that question is. What are Jackson's thoughts on mid-packers using super shoes on road ultras and runnable trail ultras, for example, Javelina or JFK 50 miler? This is from Ellie. From what I understand, the faster someone runs, the more potential benefit from super shoes. So is there a benefit for mid-pack runners over ultra distance and any potential downsides? So I'll start by saying that from the research I've looked at, it isn't conclusive that the super shoes are better or worse for either faster or slower runners. I know that there's at least one paper that found greater performance benefits in elite runners. But I also know that there's at least another paper that contradicts that finding that actually found that slower runners were provided more of a benefit than faster runners. So I would say it's inconclusive at this point. If there's like a certain user group based off of speed that the shoes help more or less than. Getting into the other part of the question. So it seems at this point pretty unanimous that these super shoes do improve performance on the roads. You could look at average times for these big city marathons. You could look at the records being set, in the half marathon and marathons for both men's and women's happening in the last couple of years. But the jury is kind of still out on if you're going to see or if we are seeing the same improvements due to the shoes on the trails. And I think, when we talk about super shoes, there's two components. There's the foam and there's the plate. So the foam is the reason why the foam is more beneficial than previous foams is just materially speaking. The foam will release more of the energy that the foam stores with each stride when you reach the the second part of your stride. So throughout a stride, the first half of the stride, the foam is storing energy, and in the second half of your stride, the foam releases energy as you spring off. And these new foams release 90% of the energy they store, as opposed to traditional foams only release about 60% of that stored energy. So that 30% improvement essentially in the spring properties of the foam means that that energy doesn't need to be produced by the muscles. So there's a really easy explanation as to why and how the foam is improving performance. When it comes to the plates, it's not as well understood how, or even if at all, the plate itself, what impact that is having on performance. And, I've talked to people that, I worked with in grad school who, are some of the brightest minds when it comes to the shoe technology, and they're unwilling to say whether or how the foam may or may not be improving. There's lots of theories out there, but nothing's that well understood at this point. So when we actually talk about then making decisions with how and why we should use certain shoes in different contexts, if you're finding a shoe that has the newer foam technologies, with the most common new one being the PIBA-based foams, I don't see there being a downside using shoes with that foam for ultra running, or trail running, or road running, right? All running, with the foams providing being a little more spring-like. That's going to I don't see any downsides in that for performance. When it comes to picking a shoe with a plate, the plates generally decrease proprioception on the trails, meaning that the more technical or more steep terrain you're on, the plates are probably going to be hurting more than helping. So if you're not going to be seeing these, I don't think you're seeing many athletes for super steep or super technical races using shoes that have plates in them. But when you're looking at the more runnable stuff, that is where you are seeing some athletes that do choose to use some of these shoes that have plates in them. And I think it really just comes down to a cost benefit analysis of, is the foam slash plate helping more than the plate is hurting on the more technical stuff. So I think just like we've always had to do, both in shoes 10 years ago and shoes now, there's certain shoes that are right for certain situations, and that's going to look a little bit different for each athlete. So I don't think I could conclusively say across the board that athletes should be using these newer technology shoes for runnable trail ultras, because every race looks a little different and every athlete is going to respond a little bit differently to the shoes. But I think if you have a shoe that only has the newer foam and not the plate, a shoe like the Nike Zagama, for example, which has PIBA based foam but no plate, I don't see a downside to using that if that works well with your foot. But if your shoe does have a plate in it, just figure out ahead of time whether that's something that your body is using well, and is something that you're comfortable with. I see Dean here has a question. From your research, what have you found in practice with uphill gaits for mid packers? I'll maybe answer another question, Dean, if you want to clarify exactly what you're asking there, and then I'll come back to that once I have a better idea of what you want to know. So I'm looking over other questions that were asked ahead of time. So what are the best types of cross training, and how can these be incorporated into improving running? So I'll start by saying I'll define cross training, at least for the sake of this question, as other forms of cardiovascular aerobic exercises. So strength training, I'm not going to define that as cross training just for the sake of this question. Because that kind of opens up a whole kettle of fish. But I'll be talking about things such as cycling or Nordic skiing, ski touring or ski mountaineering, swimming. So things that are mimic the kind of cardiometabolic stress of running on the cardiovascular system, on the metabolic system. And, I don't think there's one correct answer of, cycling being better than Nordic skiing being better than swimming, but it really just kind of depends on your situation. So if you live in a place where it's hard to train throughout the winter via running, but you have access to uh, terrain where you can either Nordic ski or ski uphill, through ski touring or ski mountaineering, that might be a good mode to use, throughout the winter months when run training is a little bit harder. If you're injured, and come spring, come summertime, I think cycling's a really good mode where it can still scratch that adventure itch that is a component of why a lot of why we run and like to run in the trails in the mountains. And if you have enough skill with cycling and, have a gravel bike or a mountain bike and can still get out into the outdoors in the mountains, that's kind of a way that satiates some of that emotional component to, that's attached to our identity as athletes while still kind of getting in a similar uh, aerobic or cardiovascular stimulus as you would for running. When it comes to I think if you're focused on cross training that are more lower limbed, so skiing or biking, that's generally going to translate over to running fitness a little bit better than rowing or swimming, for example, which are still cardiovascular in nature, but not as leg dominant. So if you're able to mimic the specific muscles being used that are a little bit more similar to running, I think that's going to translate a little bit better. But a big part of this is also just motivation. So ultimately, if you're excited to be doing a different form of training and excited about a specific cross training modality, I would rather an athlete do the form that they're enjoying, even if that's is swimming or and is a little bit less specific towards running. All right, seeing if Dean added anything, but still waiting. So I'll move on to another question. So another pre-asked question was, what is it like racing at the Trail Mountain World Championships, especially given the team scoring format? So I had the opportunity. This was summer of 2023 to race, for Team USA at that World's race. And one of the things that I experienced and this was the only time I've experienced this in a longer trail race, was, I got stuck early on in the race behind where I wanted to be in the field. And, as someone who is usually towards the front of the pack, I hadn't ever experienced, kind of getting funneled onto a single track a mile, 2 miles into a race and not being able to move up, because normally, there's only four or five or, a couple people around you versus, being surrounded by dozens of athletes and not being able to move up, until we got onto a road, about an hour into the race. And then I was able to move up. So at that World's race in Austria, 10 kilometers into the race, I was in something like 95th place. And by the finish, I was in 30th place. And part of that was because, I didn't get out strong enough in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the race and just ended up kind of being stuck in this conga line as we're all, hundreds of athletes were, just kind of shoulder to shoulder, and in a big conga line for that first hour. So that was something I hadn't experienced really since high school cross country. But talking about the team format and how that impacted the way the race played out. So there were 5 of us on the U.S. team, on the U.S. men's team for that race, and the top 3 athletes scored. And the way the scoring worked was it was the cumulative time of those top 3 athletes from the country. So early on in the race, I was either the 4th or 5th U.S. athlete, and there definitely was a motivation to try to get in the top three and be one of the scorers for the team. So obviously, there's all sorts of inspiration, that you're using, when you're in a race, but wanting to be in the top three, so I was, one of those scorers, was an added source of motivation. And because it was time based and not place based for that scoring, late in the race when there were, when I was running into the town where the finish line was, and there was no athletes within a couple minutes of me, I was still, giving it my all, knowing that, if I could run this last mile 10 seconds, 15 seconds quicker, than if I kind of just eased into the finish line, that could, theoretically make a difference on how we placed as a team, because I did end up being being the third US athlete. So yeah, that was just a unique experience where there were different forms of motivation at play, given the US, the scoring, and then my placing within the team. All right, so this was a pre-asked question, but maybe this will also tie in to what Dean was asking. But how can I improve uphill running and hiking plus switching between them? So I think the uh, number one thing someone can do to just improve their ability on steep terrain, whether that's hiking, running, or both, is just to put yourself in that environment more. So, a lot of times athletes aren't as motivated to seek out terrain where their pace is going to be slower, or, where they are going to have to hike in training. A lot of us just, will run from our home, run through the neighborhood, and that's a large proportion of our mileage. But being intentional about going, and even if it means driving somewhere, to seek out steeper terrain, if that is something you're trying to improve upon, or is the sort of terrain that you will be racing on, is going to be well worth your while. Um, and the, we've, talking about, there's a cardiovascular component to training, and then also a biomechanical component to training. You could be, as fit as possible, for road running, but you're still going to struggle if you're doing steep terrain in your races and you haven't experienced that in training. So, kind of an obvious answer, but the number one thing you can do to improve is just to be intentional about putting yourself in that environment in training. The other thing I'll add that maybe is a little bit less common sense is, I think most athletes need to give themselves permission to hike earlier than they would otherwise be inclined to do. Pun intended with the inclined. But I think because most of us come at this from a running lens, as opposed to maybe a mountaineer's lens, and we are, more in tune with kind of the running than the hiking. I often notice that athletes, will kind of stubbornly be hiking or be running things, be running climbs in training or in racing, that if they gave themselves permission to hike, would actually improve their performance on that climb or throughout the race. By maybe saving their legs for later in the race, if they, allow themselves to hike a little bit earlier, or, most climbs aren't a consistent incline, right? There's sections that are steeper, there's sections that are more gradual. So if early on in a climb, you give yourself permission to hike those steeper sections, and then that allows you to run the more gradual sections later in a climb, versus, being stubborn and forcing yourself to run that steeper section earlier, but then that, exhausting you to the point that you're walking that gradual section towards the top of the climb. That's not going to be the most effective for performance. So giving yourself permission to hike, and kind of learning by experiencing it in training, kind of where that threshold is for you for effort, where it's worth actually switching gaits, is going to, I think, play out in the long run. And yeah, a lot of things I'll tell athletes, if they are doing a race where they're unsure about whether they should be walking or running some of the climbs, or in training, is, when in doubt, give yourself permission to hike, because, like I said earlier, your natural inclination is probably to run a little bit more than you should be on that steep terrain. So by giving yourself that permission to walk a little sooner, or on a steeper section of terrain, I often find that that'll improve performance in the long run. All right, and then maybe this to kind of ties into that, but this was another question from Ellie. But Jackson has done well at and enjoyed steep and technical trail races. What are your top tips for someone to train for these sorts of races when they have limited access to trails and vert in training? So I'll maybe use an example to kind of be the main way I answer this question. But I had an athlete that I coached a couple of years ago for the Broken Arrow race in Lake Tahoe, who lived in downtown Chicago. And, he didn't have the ability to drive somewhere where he could, uh, train on trails or in the mountains. And we just, kind of gave what he had at his disposal. And, he was someone who was mentally willing to, do a lot of his training indoors if that meant um, that he would arrive at that start line in Lake Tahoe for that steep technical race more prepared. So he lived in I think it was a 25-story high rise. So once a week for 90 minutes or 2 hours, which was about as much as I was willing to, mentally put him through, we would have him be doing just laps in that, 25-story stairwell, just up and down, the stairwell for 90 minutes or 2 hours. And, he did that once a week for the last, 2 to 3 months going into the race, which seasoned his legs for yes the uphill, but more the downhill portion that we didn't have access to outside of that in training. And so once a week, had him in the stairwell. The another day a week, we put him on a treadmill at a 12% grade, because I believe was the average grade that Broken Arrow race was, and just put him on that uphill treadmill for also 90 minutes to 2 hours. Just kind of getting used to that average uphill incline, and we would vary it a little bit because the race, and the climbs also vary. It's not just a consistent grade, but just from those 2 sessions a week, one that was more the uphill treadmill focused, and then the other just in the stairwell, trying to season those quads and those leg muscles for the downhill component. He arrived at the start line prepared for the terrain and the vertical that was part of that course, and he got through it in one piece, and his legs never gave out on him, and he finished strong. And I think that kind of shows that if you're willing to be creative and you're willing to put up with some maybe less fun mental experiences, it will a little bit does go a long way for getting you ready for that mountainous terrain. And most of us have access to some form of that indoor vertical that we can do, whether it's a treadmill or a stairwell or a parking garage or whatever it may be. And if you're willing to put yourself through that, that can pay dividends come race day. All right, Dean put another question here and asked for tips for downhill running and downhill walking. Let me think for a moment. So I think I'll start with downhill running. And I think just to kind of echo some of the themes from earlier, if it's something that you're going to be experiencing racing, try to put yourself in that environment in training. In terms of form tips, I think a lot of people have a tendency to lean back on downhills a little bit too far, trying to, it's a balance thing. But if you're able to kind of maintain a somewhat consistent, from, lining up your joints from your knees to your hips to your shoulders and not leaning way back at your hips, that can actually, not fighting gravity as much can, lead to some improvements. For downhill walking, I think if you're doing an ultra where you do find yourself walking a lot of it, including the downhills, uh, having practice and knowing how to use poles to lessen the impact on your joints and allowing the poles to absorb some of that force of each stride, I think that can, whether that improves walking speed or saves your legs by allowing the poles to kind of perform some of that braking force that your legs would otherwise have to do, and then that allows the fatigue to kind of hit later. I think that's worth practicing with those poles if you are walking on downhills, and if you're really skilled with poles and have a lot of experience with them. There might even be a time and place for using them in downhill running if you have the technique and ability to do so. But that's a lot harder and probably something that someone needs a lot of practice with before they try to utilize it in a race. All right, looking at another pre-asked question. Is it worth focusing on short races to help prepare for ultras? So whether you end up actually racing anything, I would say that at least training as if you were um, doing short races, doing some higher intensity work throughout a training cycle, um, that might look more similar to someone training for shorter races can improve your ultra performance. And, I think a good way to think about this is, almost like a trickle down effects where if you're doing a lot of high intensity work, especially maybe far away from your ultramarathon, so 6 to 9 months before a 100 miler, let's say, if you're focusing on some of that more high intensity work, that might look more similar to the types of workouts an athlete training for a 5K and 10K is doing, and you improve basically your ceiling, your ability to run at that higher end. Then when you transition more into the slower or more ultra specific portions of your season, um, I think you're going to find that that floor, that slower end stuff, is going to be a little bit higher than it would have been otherwise if you were neglecting, doing that high intensity work. So I think it's one of those things where if you pull on that high end in training and improve your ability to run a 5K, theoretically that then improves your 10K ability, which improves your half marathon ability, et cetera, down to that 100 miler. And if if you are kind of working on a range of exercise intensities throughout a training cycle and throughout a year, such that you're improving your ability kind of as a well-rounded runner and a well-rounded athlete, that's going to bring up the uh, part of your training or the style of race that you enjoy doing the most. So I think a kind of big picture way to look at this is improve and work on your weaknesses far away from your goal race of the year. And then as you get closer to your event, work more on your strengths and the things that are more specific to your goal race. But throughout a year, if you're working on kind of every portion of training and a variety of exercise intensities, I do think that will improve your ability towards whatever your goal event is. So finding another question here. How many ultras should I run in a year? So the way the question is phrased, it says, how many ultras should I run in a year? And I would say that that number looks a lot different than if the question was, how many ultras should I race in a year? So if you're training for a 100 or a 200 miler, you might be going out, 20 to 30 weekends a year and doing an ultra distance training run. And, if you counted that as an ultra, right, all of a sudden that number is, in the dozens. But, if you're actually trying to race at a high level, in multiple ultras in a year, I don't think that number really should be any higher than 4 to 5. Um, and even that, I think would be more on the shorter side of the ultras, doing 50Ks and 50 milers. I don't think you're going to, uh, have the best performance if you're trying to do 400 milers in a year, for example. So, I think if you're, it's one thing to be doing, training races or just going out and running ultra distances in training. And there, I don't think there's any specific number. Again, I'd be hard pressed to find very many athletes who are running over a marathon length, more than 20 to 30 times in a year in a training context. But if you're actually wanting to maximize your performance, I don't think that you would be able to uh, do more than 4 or 5 ultras in a year. And even then, most of those would probably be 50Ks and 50 milers or 100Ks, and only 1 or 2 100 milers in a year if you want to maximize performance at all of those. Dean asked a question for a very flat 100 miler. Should you start with a run walk ratio or run until you can't and then walk? So I would generally prescribe athletes who were in this situation to, if they thought that late in the race there would be a significant proportion of walking, I would rather them start with that run walk ratio early on. And I almost, I think there's a parallel there with when I was answering that question about, when you do a steep climb, there's going to be sections that are gradual, throughout that climb. And if you hike the steeper sections, and that allows yourself to run the more gradual sections by not over fatiguing yourself early in the climb, you can almost answer this, case of a flat 100 miler in a similar way where, if you do some form of a run walk from the gun in this 100 miler, that's likely going to allow you then late in the race, 70, 80, 90 miles in, to run a higher percentage than you would have been otherwise. So if you, ran the first 40 miles of this flat 100 miler, but then you had to run walk, 50-50 the last 20 milers, versus if you had done some form of a run walk, over that first 40 milers, and then in the last 20 miles, you were able to do a 70-30, run walk split. That's probably going to lead to better performance in the long run because, I noticed, I think this is something, especially at 100 milers, but your ability to run well in the last 20 or 30 miles is, generally is going to be what makes or breaks your race. So, the amount you have to lose or gain in the first 20 to 30 miles is usually, is usually a fraction of that difference, in the last 20 or 30 milers. So I don't think banking time by being aggressive early on is going to pay off. And I think that also applies for doing a run walk style as opposed to just running the whole thing. All right, I am going to answer one more question. I can tell my voice is getting a little scratchy, and we are getting close to that 45-minute mark. So looking through some of these questions, I want to find a good one. So I'll maybe end with another personal one, but what FKT routes have you run and how do you approach them differently than races? So, there's obviously a whole host of flavors of FKT, fastest known time type events, but the ones that I've generally focused on are more adventurous and ones that require even a little bit of mountaineering skill, whether that's, a little bit of rock climbing or, some that have had snow components. So, um, when you're dealing with something that requires more technical skill and more gear and more mountaineering ability, that's going to have, an impact on performance, sometimes even more than the fitness or, your ability to run, which is kind of all that, if you're just doing a standard trail race, right? You're not wearing a helmet. You're not scrambling up rocks. So, the biggest difference for the FKTs that I've done have been more of a focus on the logistical components and the mountaineering components, and making sure I'm moving safely and making sure, uh, I kind of know where my gear is, and access to my gear, and limiting stoppages. Um, the my favorite FKT that I've done was this 75-mile traverse of the Steens Mountain in Eastern Oregon that I did with another famous runner. Another famous implies that I'm famous, but a famous runner named Max King. And that took us 30 hours, and it was, I think, 95% off trail. And, we crossed one road, which was the only time we were able to resupply. And we're filling up our own water at creeks and carrying all our food for the whole night, and all that stuff. And our ability to make sure we packed enough food and had proper clothing and had what we needed to in our first aid kit when things went wrong out there, that had a bigger impact on performance than our ability to run a 50K, or even run a 100 miler at that point. Our that took us 30 hours. Our average pace was somewhere between 2 and 3 miles per hour. So that wasn't a fitness event. That was, certainly fitness came into play because, you've got to have some level of fitness to move for 30 hours and run or walk 75 miles. But having that technical skill and that mountaineering experience had a bigger impact on performance than just that pure fitness. So for those style of FKTs, that there's kind of that interplay between just your running fitness and your mountain competency. And I find it a lot of fun doing things and doing those adventures where having mountain skills comes into play. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I think I will call it there. This Facebook Live should be available on the Trails and Tarmac website, as well as the Facebook Sharman Ultra Facebook page. So hopefully people are able to check this out after the fact. Appreciate everyone that was here listening and asking questions, and that was a lot of fun. Talk to you later.